Imagine, if you will, a socialist utopia where all workers make $15 per hour. That's about $31,200 per year for a 40-hour work week. Doesn't sound like much of a utopia. And when you complain that you are working many more hours beyond that 40 that you don't get paid for, the response from your employer is to cut your hours to ensure that you get your $15 per hour. As the saying goes, that's not a good way to run a railroad, and definitely no way to run a political campaign where many hours are needed to reach the masses. We'll talk about the mess that the Bernie Sanders campaign has gotten into in this episode of Analysis Behind the News, where we provide the perspective that you can use to help save American liberty and independence. Self-declared socialist Bernie Sanders made headlines earlier this year when he announced that all of his presidential campaign staffers were being unionized. Sanders, who pushes a $15 per hour minimum wage and equates it with a living wage, is now having to deal with the ramifications that come with unionizing your employees. Now, amid union negotiations, campaign staffers who perform the bulk of the work are complaining that they are not making a living wage, but are paid starving wages. As we stated, Bernie's response is to cut their hours so that the $15 per hour is then realized. Even former employees from his 2016 campaign agree that this won't work because of all the work that must be done. Campaigners typically see about 60-hour work weeks. Are you beginning to see the disconnect here? The incentive to want to do a great job is taken away when, as an employer, you don't reward your employees. Those working for the Sanders campaign will become more discontent with their limited hours. Something will need to change, or Bernie will see his outreach numbers plummet. Yet this is something that we would expect to see from someone who thinks that the free market needs to be controlled with arbitrary wage numbers. NPR recently reported that the Congressional Budget Office released a study on what a $15 per hour minimum wage would do to workers. They state that 17 million workers would see their wage increase, and that anywhere between 0 and 3.7 million would lose their jobs. Just like Sanders, if employers have to pay for this, they will find ways to lessen its impact, like cutting hours and perhaps turning to part-time employees, or perhaps not even offering any benefits. And let's face facts. Unions typically are organized against someone or something. Sanders' employees are not organized for him. Rather, they are organized against him as an employer who must now have a level of accountability for the promises that he gave to his employees and to the policies in which he campaigns for. But as his workers are finding out, the socialist utopia of a controlled economy is crashing headlong into economic reality. Human factors such as drive, emotion, and attitude cannot be managed, and workers will indeed go elsewhere. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reported that some of his workers have left already. Managed economies under socialism have a terrible track record. Venezuela is just the most recent example of a very prosperous country that was driven into the ground by socialism's scheme of forced wealth redistribution. As the late economist Henry Hazlitt wrote in his book, Economics in One Lesson, in brief, he writes, the main problem we face today is not economic, but political. Sound economists are in substantial agreement concerning what ought to be done. Practically all government attempts to redistribute wealth and income tend to smother productive incentives and lead toward general impoverishment. It is the proper sphere of government to create and enforce a framework of law that prohibits force and fraud. But it must refrain from specific economic interventions. Government's main economic function is to encourage and preserve a free market. It is what every citizen is entitled to ask of his government. And he goes on to state, the outlook is dark, but it is not entirely without hope. Here and there, one can detect a break in the clouds. More and more people are becoming aware that government has nothing to give them without first taking away from somebody else. That's key. Or from themselves. Increased handouts to selected groups mean merely increased taxes or increased deficits and increased inflation. And inflation, in the end, misdirects and disorganizes production. Even a few politicians are beginning to recognize this, and some of them are even to state it clearly. He wrote those words in 1978, 32 years after he wrote the original book. Now, this book sweeps away the economic falsities that those building big government advocate. So if you're interested in preserving the American system of government, then you need to understand the role that economics play. We highly recommend Mr. Hazlitt's book, which boils down the concepts into very easy reading. And when you're finished reading it, loan it to somebody else and ask for a follow-up discussion. It's just one way you can help build that educated army. Now, each of us has a responsibility to keep our government operating within the confines of its limitations by holding our elected officials accountable. The John Birch Society can help you do just that by working on a 10-point agenda that preserves and restores American liberty and independence. Visit jbs.org today to apply for membership. And please, subscribe and like and share this video with others. Until next time, we'll see you then.